Hello, everyone. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School at the University of Denver, and welcome to another Faculty Friday. In fact, our first Faculty Friday of 2023. Perhaps the most important issue facing the world today is the state of democracy. Certainly got our attention here at the Korbel School. And there's a veritable cottage industry of books out now with titles like How Democracies Die, Democracy in Chains, The Twilight of Democracy, The Road to Unfreedom, and not that long ago, Madeleine Albright's Fascism, A Warning. In fact, the New York Times has a reading list of books on democratic decline if you want to be depressed. And there's really good evidence that there's democratic erosion in most of the world's most populous countries, China, Russia, issues in India, Brazil, and yes, even the United States. Freedom House reports that freedom has been on the decline for now, I think, 17 years. The Economist's Democracy Index is at its lowest measure since it was launched. The Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDEA, latest report says the world is becoming more authoritarian as non-democratic regimes become even more brazen in their repression. And according to the Varieties of Democracy, VDEM, perhaps the leading organization in the world measuring what's happening to democracy, now 70% of the world's population live in some form of autocracy. A bit depressing. But I'm very pleased that I'm joined today by my colleague, Professor Rachel Sigman, to talk about the state of democracy around the world. Rachel's an assistant professor here at the Korbel School, assistant professor of democratic governance, and a project manager with VDEM. We were very excited to recruit Rachel this past year from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. Her research focuses broadly on democracy and the politics of government performance, with a particular focus on Africa. Her forthcoming book, Parties, Political Finance, and Governance in Africa, to be published any day now, I think, by Cambridge University Press, explains how political parties shape politicians' strategies to extract money from the state, from government, to finance their political operations, and why that matters. She's worked on a wide range of issues, measurement of state capacity, democracy and exclusion, the effects of oil revenue on governance, and the relationship between economic inequality and autocratization. Welcome to Faculty Friday, Rachel.
Thank you, Fritz. It's a pleasure to be here.
Just as a reminder to our audience, Rachel and I will talk for a while, but we want to take your questions. So please put them in the Q&A or the chat. I guess we have a Q&A button, and we will get to as many of them as we can. So, Rachel, a lot of your work is around, especially the work you do with VDEM, is around measuring democracy. And let me just start with a basic question, which is, what is democracy? Or, maybe if that's too big, at least how can we measure it? How do we know whether it's in decline or not?
Okay, well, I see you decided to start with the simple questions, right? So, of course, there are many, many different conceptions and different dimensions and moving parts of democracy, right? I think for everybody you would ask, what do they see as democracy? You'd get, unique answers to all of those questions. I think most of what we hear about today in both in scholarly work and in the news coverage of sort of trends in democracy embodies what we would think of as sort of the small L liberal elements of democracy that tend to emphasize, for example, free and fair elections, limits on executive power, the protection of individual rights and freedoms, the rule of law, among other things that sort of focus on the limited nature of government. But that's certainly not the only conception of democracy. In 2021, for example, the Chinese government put out a white paper sort of explaining what they see as democracy. And for them, they emphasize sort of democracy that works, or the results-oriented view of democracy that looks at sort of what democracy accomplishes for the people. Another sort of aspect of democracy, one thing I worked on when I was at the VDEM Institute as a postdoctoral fellow, is looking at how to kind of incorporate concepts related to equality for understanding, why democracies, for understanding the foundations of liberal democracy and why democracies are able to sort of sustain themselves or not. So there's, of course, many, many different ways that we can define democracy, and there are many different aspects of it that are, important in various ways. But like I said, sort of there's been a convergence, I think, at least in the sort of mainstream political science approaches, focusing on these liberal conceptions of democracy. In part, I think, because those have been the most sustainable, at least in Western countries and in many other places around the world. And so when we measure democracy, we often sort of look to measure sort of the most fundamental or the most basic tenets of liberal democracy. In building on the work of Robert Dahl primarily, those tend to include contestation in elections, right? So basically what that means is, are the outcomes of elections uncertain? Do we not know them, know what's going to happen before the election takes place? And does the opposition have a theoretically feasible chance of winning? The second piece of that would be participation. Can the entire adult population participate in elections or other sort of political contests? And then finally would be sort of the basic protection of rights and freedoms that enables contestation and participation to happen. So freedom of association, freedom of speech, voting rights, et cetera.
That's great. So, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no. So I was just going to say most of the measures, the most common measures of democracy, the ones that you mentioned, tend to, at a minimum, sort of embody those core principles.
Well, let's run with that, although we could come back maybe at the end to the Chinese definition, or more generally to the question of the efficacy of democracy in accomplishing things. But let's, within the, that definition, as you said, sort of on which a number of organizations have more or less converged. All right, how bad is it? I mean, we get these these glaring headlines. How bad is it? Is democracy truly in decline around the world, or is there somewhat more nuanced picture?
So that's actually a very timely question. There's currently a debate which made it into the New York Times this morning about sort of what the data are telling us, and different, I'd say, what different types of data are telling us, and then what different types of interpretations there are of the data. And so, as we've talked about, I've worked with the VDEM project for a while now, and so I'll start with them. And so, their measures combine both what we might call like objective or factual measures, looking at, for example, does a country hold elections regularly, right? Is there a formal, right to vote for all adults or something like that? Combining, and then they also produce what would be called more subjective data, which uses country experts to assess really harder to measure concepts. For example, whether or not in general women have equal rights to men, and whether those rights are actually protected on the ground, or for example, whether the civil society, the environment for civil societies is relatively open or closed. So things that are difficult to measure with more objective data. So, with the sort of combination of those two types of data that they put together, and then they aggregate all the country expert ratings using quite state-of-the-art statistical techniques. And what they've seen in the last, definitively beginning around 2016, but with signs going back to kind of 2010, 2012, is that for sure, as you mentioned, the percentage of population living in non-democratic countries has increased quite significantly. If we look at just global averages, like the average country score on a democracy index, the picture is a little bit less clear. There's been some decline, but not nearly as significant as when we're weighting it by population because of some of the larger countries that you mentioned, India, China, Brazil, Turkey, et cetera.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, but a couple of papers have come out in the last several months, really, that present a slightly more mixed picture. And so, for example, if we look at the number of countries that maybe have been experiencing democratic backsliding, but have actually moved from a democracy to an authoritarian regime, that there are far fewer, and especially among established democracies, we've seen very few that have actually sort of wholesale reversed their democratic credentials. Likewise, a paper that just came out in the last couple of weeks looks specifically at some core sort of more objective indicators, like are incumbents losing elections at greater rates, or are journalists being killed more frequently. And this paper finds that when it comes to those sort of very visible manifestations of democratic backsliding, that the story is one of more of stability than of decline.
So it's definitely more complicated than meets the eye. We could probably take particular countries and look at them. As you note, it does depend on whether you sort of weight by population. Very China, India, Brazil, et cetera, Turkey, you mentioned, that we're not getting close to half the world's population just in a handful of countries. So it's hard not to see them as visible. But another of those countries is the United States. And I know most of your work is not focused directly on the United States, but there's been, and we certainly have not come close to sliding into an authoritarian state, but there are other forms of backsliding, I guess. And so I'd be curious what your take is on the general conversation about whether America is in decline as well. The United States is in decline as well. I've probably been guilty of, on occasion, being one of those voices worrying about that. What's your take on that?
Yeah, this is a really tough one. So, we've definitely seen sort of very concerning developments, undermining of checks and balances, constraints on the executive, worrying trends in sort of electoral rules and participation and voting rights in some states in particular. Other types of, undermining of rights, women's rights, et cetera, related to abortion cases, and so forth. So there's no question that there is, that there are sort of signs of democratic decline, that these developments are having an impact on people, and we shouldn't lose sight of that, right? But on the other hand, there's also, some positive stories, I guess. I think, here in Colorado, for example, there's been sort of expansions in access to voting through mail ballots and other election processes. I think if we look at the trajectory of rights for LGBTQ people, that, we've seen a very, very positive trend for the most part, right? Of course, when we talk about rights for transsexuals and stuff, that's less positive, and in some cases very negative. But I think, it's very hard with these sort of aggregate measures at the country level to really get a very, very clear picture of what's going on within one country. And so I would say with the US, the jury is still out. We have seen some signs of, I think, democratic resilience in the last couple of years and in the last couple of elections. But I think ultimately, this is a process. Democracy is something we continually shape and have to protect and guard, and is constantly under threat. So I think this is,
I suppose, here in the US, we have to guard against the all too easy tendency to imagine that was some golden age of democracy in the past, when in fact, as you were pointing out, many of the voices that are being heard today were really not heard in the past. And so from many people's perspective, I suppose, notwithstanding the issues in the current moment, this is as democratic a moment as the U.S. has had. I mean, the obvious points of, women couldn't vote. I mean, when we started, it was just people who look like me who were really able to vote, right? And so we've made a lot of progress in that regard. Well, nuanced picture of the world, some bright spot in the U.S. and elsewhere, bright spots elsewhere I know in the world, complicated issues of measuring and determining whether there is a democratic erosion. But let me turn to the kind of drivers of this. Where decline is happening, and it is clearly happening in some places. What do we know? What appear to be the major drivers of that? What are the factors that seem to be pushing those places that are becoming more authoritarian to in that direction?
Yeah, it's, I think, very difficult to pinpoint any specific drivers. I think we've seen really sort of impressive amount of social change and technological change, and change in our health and climate landscape. So I think it becomes very difficult to sort of sort through the many possible factors, but I'll just sort of outline some of the main sort of categories of drivers that I think people are studying and focusing on. So I think one thing, that gets a fair amount of attention is just changes in the sort of international balance of power, right? So specifically the rise of Russia and China, and the perhaps weakening of the US as a protector of democracy, particularly, under President Trump. And so, I think in terms of like the international environment has become, potentially less friendly to democracy and less likely to sort of push and prod countries to maintain democratic institutions. Another possible explanation, of course, relates to the media landscape and just changes in the way that people receive news, changes in the fact that the use of social media, private media, consolidation of political power through the private, over the private media. And so, certainly there's a lot going on that, and then of course, active misinformation campaigns. So there's a lot going on in the information environment that is, potentially contributing to popular conceptions of democracy and governance, popular support for non-democratic leaders and movements, and kind of a polarization as well. There's certainly no shortage of economic explanations. So sort of tracing things back to the 2008 financial crisis, thinking about globalized capitalism and the ways that the concentration of economic power into a sort of elite core who dominates both the political and economic worlds has made it easier for leaders to consolidate power because they hold both the economic and political power. Additionally, growing levels of inequality perhaps lead people to become sort of jaded or more supportive of anti-system, anti-regime, populist types of movements that that seek to undermine existing institutions and existing political settlements. And then there I think is also kind of an emerging body of work that focuses on weaknesses or problems within the political system itself. And so this could be anything from sort of weakening political parties and the quality of representation that they provide to the population, as well as institutions that might be outdated. We have debates in this country about the Electoral College or the representation of the Senate, and some of the less democratic institutions that we've held on to for some time, and whether or not those are sort of providing openings to manipulation by a tyranny of a majority kind of thing.
Well, that's quite a menu of places. Almost a
yeah, and I didn't even talk about all
so,
of them.
Yeah, so I'm going to make you pick one. And no, but I mean, it does feel like there's an intersection of all of these forces, and I've been interested in now in the relationship between climate change and democracy, and the ways in which the stressors that climate change is likely to cause are also stressors on democracy, whether it's through migration or food insecurity or other things. So we have no lack of possible villains in this story, to be sure. Let me turn now to Africa, because a lot of your work is on Africa, and maybe we can actually some of those issues we can sort of see how they're playing out in places that you've studied. I mean, obviously, Africa is a huge continent. It's incredibly complicated. It's not really fair to generalize about Africa in many ways, and much of your work, I think, is really on West Africa. But I am going to ask you to generalize a bit. I mean, what can we say about the trajectory of democracy in Africa, or perhaps, if you want, in West Africa, where you've focused most of your work?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for pointing out that it is very difficult to generalize that there is extreme variation among the 54, 55 countries on the continent, and a lot of my work tries to understand that variation. I think the historical context is important here. Prior to 1990, I think there were only 2 countries in Africa that sort of regularly held elections in which an opposition could have plausibly won, but they didn't. And things changed very rapidly after the end of the Cold War, amidst economic and fiscal crises happening across the world, but felt particularly hard in many African countries. And so, there were, in some cases, fairly rapid sort of regime transitions toward more open and democratic regimes. In other cases, that those processes were more drawn out. In some cases, they were accompanied by civil wars, et cetera. So there's been, between 1990 and 2010, there was sort of this quite rapid political transformation across the continent. And so I think what we're seeing today is sort of a slowing of that change. There are certainly countries that have experienced quite serious rollbacks in their sort of democratic progress of the last 20 years, or the last 30 years, I should say. But there are many others that continue sort of along this process toward more open and democratic systems. And so, on average, if we average out that line, what we tend to get is, democracy is no longer growing across the continent, but it's sort of maintaining sort of a level that it reached, around 2010 or a little bit later.
Yeah. Well, I was struck by your report, the West African Authoritarianism Tracker, the Open Society report, where you identify several countries where there's improvement, the Gambia, Niger, Sierra Leone, and then others Benin and Mali that have gone the other direction. There's significant erosion. One country in that report, Burkina Faso, was on the rise, and until recently, as I understand, there was a coup, and now probably ought to be in the other category. So I wonder if you could say what you could say about the variation. Yes, on average, it's not much change, but what are the factors that seem to be leading to improvement in some places and to erosion in others?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I'm not sure we have really clear sort of generalizable factors or explanations for why some countries are going in one direction and others not. I think, in a lot of cases, as I was just describing, there was sort of this rapid transition to democratic rule. And a lot of the kind of supporting types of institutions, access to justice, rule of law, mechanisms to protect rights and freedoms, cultivation of independent and civil society, just did not sort of take root very strongly. And so it's become quite easy, I think, for chief executives, for presidents or prime ministers to kind of manipulate institutions in ways that help them to embed their power. And so we see these kinds of executive aggrandizement processes playing out. Benin is sort of the classic case of that, I think. And in many cases, leaders can do this. So whereas in the West, in the more established democracies, I think leaders require really strong populist movements that support them to kind of make progress in dismantling democratic institutions. I think in a lot of African countries, because the institutions are younger, not as well established, it's just easier for a small group of elites or even one person to kind of manipulate them without necessarily having a ton of popular support to do that.
Well, let's see. I mean, it seems like a great segue to your book, forthcoming book, which is, as I said at the outset, Parties, Political Finance, and Governance in Africa, which really looks at pretty closely at this sort of structure of governance, and as I said briefly, about the ways in which leaders can extract resources from the state to stay in power. So you focus on what you call extractive financing in the book, and maybe we start there. What is extractive financing? What is it that what is the phenomenon that you're studying, and I guess why is this important?
Yeah, thanks. So as political regimes have opened up, as elections have become more frequent, turnovers of power have become more frequent, elections have become more competitive, the cost of competing politically has also risen. And so, in a lot of African countries, there aren't very strong private sectors. It can be difficult to find private financing for political campaigns and political parties. And so there's a lot of pressure on everyone, really, but the incumbents are the ones who are in power to do this, to extract money from the state in order to finance their political operations, their parties, their campaigns, et cetera. And really, this is a widespread practice, not only in Africa. We've seen it in historical periods in the United States as well, and in Italy, and places all over the world. This is not necessarily something that is confined to Africa, but certainly, incumbents. It's sort of a well-known secret that they rely to a large extent on state money and state resources to compete in elections. And this is significant for a couple reasons. One, of course, is that it gives incumbents an edge, right? It tilts the playing field in their favor, because it can be much more difficult for opposition candidates and parties to access money because they are not in power. But what I really focus on in the book is the impacts it has on public policy implementation, like how politicians manage the executive and the bureaucracy in order to, well, for two reasons, right? One is to ensure that they preserve these financial advantages and that they are able to extract money from the state in order to hold on to power. And then the other, is, to what extent does that interfere with the sort of day-to-day workings of the government in ways that undermine public policy? And I show in the book that there's quite a bit of variation in the way that extraction takes place, and therefore in the ways that that governments are or are not successful in implementing their sort of policy agendas.
I know one piece of that is the role of parties, political parties, in determining whether, how benign this phenomenon is. You have a distinction between collusive and coercive extraction. I don't know how far we want to nerd out on the on the detail, but the basic idea is that I think is that stronger parties make this phenomenon somehow less worrisome than situations where you have weaker parties. Is that right? Is it?
Yeah, that's the main arc of the argument in the book. I want to just clarify that the stronger parties are just as good at extracting money as the weaker parties. Okay. So it doesn't necessarily impact the amount of financial loss that the state experiences. But what I show is that when parties have stronger, sort of a stronger core of elite members, as well as networks outside of the state, that they extract and channel monies in ways that are far less disruptive to the workings of, of state bureaucracy, state agencies. And so what ends up happening is they're able to sort of simultaneously pursue both their extractive and power, power protecting agenda, while also, having sort of less disruption to their policy agendas and the implementation of policy. And so we see more professional bureaucracies, we see more effective sort of bureaucracies, and we see stronger commitments to policy agendas, even though at the same time, money is being sort of taken from those initiatives. So.
Yeah. So at the risk of further nerding out, I wanted to sort of segue to another line of your work, which is closely related, which is the idea that governance in Africa is patrimonial or more patrimonial than it is elsewhere. And you talk about neo-patrimonial, and we could perhaps define that, but the question is well, let me ask you that, what is neo-patrimonial governance, and how does it affect democracy?
Okay, so the concept of well, let's start with patrimonialism. So this comes from Max Weber's 3 forms of legitimate authority. So authority that populations are likely to believe is legitimate, has the right to sort of govern. And so his sort of typology is rational legal authority, which we think of as being the basis for our own government. Sort of written rules and clearly defined offices that have specific functions and so forth. Charismatic authority, which is sort of a belief in an individual's, sort of their ability to govern rightly or effectively. And then traditional authority, which is based on sort of beliefs, norms that emerge from religion or culture or practice or whatever. And so patrimonialism is essentially a form of traditional authority. It's the idea that a father figure, though it certainly doesn't need to be a man, is the rightful person to wield authority because they provide for the community. And so the concept of neo-patrimonialism is the idea that there are trappings of a rational legal, a modern rational legal state. So, on paper, in the buildings, everything looks as though it is based on sort of some form of rational legal authority and organization. but that the norms and practices that sort of animate those structures are much more rooted in patrimonial types of beliefs. And this manifests in sort of three main ways. One is in sort of powerful executives, right? Having a father figure who is the guardian or the rightful sort of leader of the country. Second would be in terms of patron-client relationships. So sort of citizens' linkages to the leaders are through, not necessarily through voting and accountability, but rather through some sort of less tangible kind of exchange of goods or services or reputational benefits or something like that. And then the sort of right to use state resources for, the political leaders, the father figures benefit and for which ultimately is beneficial for the community. So all that said, what we tried to do in this one study was to actually use VDEM data to measure neo-patrimonialism, and so to construct measures of centralized executives, patron-client relations, and sort of use of state resources for private gain, and then kind of look at do African countries live up to their neo-patrimonial reputations, and then secondly, does sort of more neo-patrimonialism result in less democracy? And what we find is a very nuanced relationship that, of course, the idea of centralized executive power is inimical to democracy. But then when we look at the other two dimensions, clientelism and corruption, that we don't find a very clear relationship, and that in fact, sort of the level of neo-patrimonialism does not have any clear does not act as a hindrance to democratization.
Yeah, and I was struck by the observation as well that the kind of stereotype of Africa as patrimonialism being, typical of Africa. It turns out it's no more typical of Africa than many other regions of the world, right? So I thought that was fascinating. I want to remind our audience to put questions in the chat because I would like to turn to your questions now, and let me just take some of those questions that are on your mind, and so Cindy Sestrich asks, how do democracies face complacency and complexities in the population that seem to threaten the will of participation in democracies?
Yeah, this is a tough question. I haven't seen too much research on this this question directly. So I think one thing that's become clear, though, is that sort of the onslaught of governance challenges, bad news, climate change, COVID, democratic decline, more recently Russia and Ukraine, right? That all of these things can make individuals feel like they can't do anything to, that they're powerless, right? And certainly feeling powerless is associated with low levels of political participation and disengagement and so forth. And so I think this is a really, really important question, and one that requires more research and more understanding about how individuals can kind of overcome those feelings. But I do think, I think there's a couple sort of reasons for hope. One is that I think, we see a lot of sort of local level developments where, people have opportunities to make a difference in their immediate communities. And, sometimes it can be difficult to link those up to national or international types of developments, but nonetheless, I think, that's important, and it's sort of a bridge to, sort of broader participation and re-engagement. The other, I think, is like, if we look at if we look at voter turnout, for example, in the US, there's been a quite encouraging sort of trend in the last couple of elections of more people turning out. And so I think, I think it's important to also focus on some of the good stories. And I think that also helps to, inspire participation and make people feel like, they're not the only ones trying to, depressed about the situation in the world or trying to change it. So thanks.
Yeah. In a way, related question. One of our audience members asks whether rising economic inequality is weakening democratic systems. And can you speak more about the relationship? I know that's something you've thought quite a bit about. I mean, what's fascinating is, on the one hand, it could be a mobilizer for populations, and you do see that in places. On the other, as you've already mentioned, it may create a more an easier situation for an authoritarian to arise. So I'm curious how you think about this relationship.
Yeah, so I do think inequality is a problem. I do have one study that I think you're referring to, Fritz, looking at sort of what types of inequality are most likely to be associated with declines in democracy. And what we find in this paper, I worked on it with a couple of co-authors, is that economic inequality alone, like as measured by the distribution of incomes, such as the Gini coefficient, there's no clear relationship there that sort of more unequal income distributions have any clear relationship with movements either toward or away from democracy. But when we look at inequality in terms of state services like education, health, access to, access to power even, when we look at sort of inequality that is either perpetuated by or sort of caused by the state more directly, that does seem to have some kind of relationship. We're trying to parse out a little bit more why, and in what types of contexts that relationship is most likely to be present. But that there is sort of, when there is unevenness in sort of social policy, that does seem to undermine confidence in democratic institutions and lend support to populist movements.
Very interesting. Shifting a little bit, Bill Shaw asks, what is the role and interface between nationalism and democracy? Of course, we've seen in many ways resurgence of nationalism around the world, and I'd be curious. That's a good question. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, there's a couple of ways in which nationalism can undermine democracy. So first, obviously, to the extent that nationalism is associated with a certain ethnic or racial or religious group, that can easily sort of evolve in ways that leads to the repression of minority groups or the groups that aren't defined as part of the nation, right? So India is a really good example of this. We see that, Muslim populations in particular are being, sort of perceived by the Hindu majority as not true Indians, right? And their rights are being taken away. And that certainly has an impact on, the definite, democracy as we defined it at the outset of the session, as well as, the well-being and the sort of political vitality of those groups, those repressed groups. So certainly when nationalism takes that form, it can be particularly detrimental. The other thing I would say is that, there's quite a few studies that show that trade relationships between countries can promote democracy. That sort of the globalization of the economy and sort of open trade and open exchange of ideas and culture and and economic goods and services can be sort of a force for democratization. This is, sort of tied up in the modernization theory that was very popular and has come under more criticism. But nonetheless, there is a fair bit of evidence that when countries sort of close their borders, that becomes a potential problem for democratic development.
Yeah, and we are seeing a bit of an unwinding of that, the momentum of globalization around the world. There are a couple of questions here, really about geopolitics and the way in which it affects democracy. So one is, how do you see the Russia-Ukraine conflict impacting democratization? Some have argued that in some ways, Ukraine's democratization is a sort of deep reason behind Putin's aggression. But then the question continues, we see the EU uniting and some pushing further integration, but what about outside Europe? What's your take on the impact of Russia-Ukraine on the trajectory of democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think as the question points out, it's clear that in some ways it's perhaps had the opposite impact that Putin wanted, which is to sort of rally at least Western countries behind the democratic vision and sort of re-inspire commitment toward the liberal democratic international order. In terms of outside of the West, right, I think the main impacts we're seeing are economic, in terms of losing access to Russian and Ukrainian imports and so forth, and having crunch on food supplies. And so I think that has sort of potential kind of indirect impact on democracy, in that if economic situations worsen, on the one hand, it can cause political instability and potentially bring down democratic regimes. On the other hand, actually, in a recent article I wrote about Ghana, a co-author and I sort of make the case that actually Ghana's economic crisis may actually be strengthening its democracy. So there could be sort of mixed impacts of those kinds of things.
Yeah. Related question was around China's Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of concern about the increasing presence of China in many regions of the world, including in Africa. Any impact on democracy?
So far, not too much. I think one thing that we might see is that support from China can maybe help authoritarian regimes sort of maintain power longer, but we haven't seen sort of any clear patterns in which Chinese support or involvement ends up clearly undermining democratic institutions. That said, I think there are some things to worry about in that regard, particularly in sort of the technology and surveillance sectors, and the increasing sort of use of Chinese technologies by governments in ways that could lead to sort of more surveillance and more capacity to repress. But again, I don't think we've seen evidence that that's become, that's really come to fruition in any way.
Yeah. Question from Marcia Anderson about leadership. She poses that this leadership is much of a problem internationally as it is in this country. We don't seem to be able to identify true leaders who marshal followers, et cetera. And I guess the broader question is the role of, in some ways, the role of leadership in either promoting or undermining democracy. But how would you respond to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say two things. One is that I do think it's a problem internationally. And I think, I don't know why exactly. I think, the things we've already discussed related to sort of capitalism and economic power and money and politics are, potentially, driving some or all of the leadership problems that we see. I don't, I guess in terms of the question of how much it matters, I mean, that's a tricky one. The idea of democracy, when it functions well, it constrains leaders' ability to, to do the things we don't want them to do. So I think it's possible to sort of preserve democracy and have a vibrant democracy, even with, a bad leader or two. That said, if we have continued sort of, a constant march of very poor, sort of morally, morally devoid leaders, certainly that seems like it can wear on institutions and populations over time.
And I suppose it relates. I mean, you mentioned your article on Ghana. I mean, there's also leadership outside of the political, outside of the state, non-elected leadership, which is important in mobilizing forces for democracy, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think a really interesting question would be why or how those people who mobilize outside of the state, if they do become leaders eventually, why do they, do they preserve sort of that strong sense of leadership, or do they become sort of corrupted by power? And then, and if they don't become leaders of the state, why, or should they, or should there be avenues for them to get into elected office and so forth?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I wanted to let me thank the audience for a terrific set of questions here. I wanted to come back to something you mentioned at the beginning, and I alluded to, which is really the efficacy of democracy. I mean, so you can sort of step back from this and sort of say, so what? Like what why do we care so much about democracy? And many, and some at least, have made the case that, well, autocracies are better at dealing with climate change or dealing with COVID, at least until recently, maybe in China. And they look at the apparent dysfunction of the U.S. and other Western countries, and our inability to take, to take action on various things. And so I guess the question is, what is, how do you make the case for democracy as in the familiar phrase, the worst form of government accepting all others? That is, that it's actually the best form of government in order to tackle some of these very difficult problems.
Yeah, well, there's been quite a bit of research that tries to get at these questions, right? Compares the performance of democratic countries versus authoritarian ones. And of course, these types of studies are difficult to, these are difficult things to measure and difficult things to assess. But in general, I think, there's fairly convincing evidence that that democracies on average do perform as well, if not better, than authoritarian regimes. And we often think about, cases like Singapore or, rapid economic growth in China and really transformation of both socially and economically in China over the last 30 or 40 years. And those cases are really outliers, I think. If we think about most authoritarian regimes, they're not effectively addressing challenges. They're not growing their economies. They're not protecting, populations, securing welfare and so forth. And in many cases, they're actually actively harming people. And that's not to say that democracies are perfect, or that, we figured out exactly how to do these things well in democracies, or that people aren't harmed in democracies. We know absolutely that that's the case. But on average, I think there's, a fair amount of evidence that it's really sort of rare that authoritarian regimes perform at least consistently or well on a lot of the things we really care about. And the last thing I'll say is, I think, so much of what we're dealing with today, climate change, migration, COVID, pandemics, is international in nature, right? And so it's not to say that, we can't have sort of cooperative action between democratic and authoritarian regimes, but we do know that democratic countries tend to have friendlier relations with each other, and tend to, be able to work together in more productive ways than with authoritarian regimes.
So so to follow up on that, if we're thinking about these global issues that do require global cooperation, still our best bet is some sort of alliance of democracies, or we're more likely to solve these problems if we have stronger democracies around the world than weaker, right?
Well, I think to the extent that democracies are more likely to be responsive to their populations, to be able to gain and convey accurate information from their populations, I think we're, to the extent that democracies bring that to the international arena, that's an advantage, right? If governments are trying to hide things about what's going on in their country, or they're not willing to acknowledge the plight of certain parts of their populations, or they're suppressing or even changing information, right? That creates a very, very difficult governing task and difficult sort of collective action task, to move forward on anything.
And so the last question on this, it does seem there's sort of a time question. That is to say, in the short run, it may be tempting to, or one might imagine ways in which the autocrat can outperform the democracy. But the danger one sees, and there's much written about Putin and Xi Jinping, about, in the long run, you as a leader in those circumstances, you stop getting good information. You make mistakes. You don't have, as you say, you don't have the input of the society. Is that a fair characterization of the longer term fragility of authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is a fair characterization. I think it's most clear that those sort of vulnerabilities are apparent when the authoritarian regime is based on sort of personalistic forms of power, right? So one thing we've seen occur in China is that sort of the power of the party and the mass party structure has effectively been undermined recently by Xi Jinping's moves to kind of consolidate power around himself. And that in particular is, I think, dangerous and undermining of stability, because effectively what it means is sort of loyalty to the leader becomes the core principle, the core organizing principle of the regime, rather than membership in a mass party with structures, or if we're talking about monarchies, some type of order that's based on beliefs about who has a God-given right to rule, or something like that. So it really sort of undermines it, puts all the focus on the leader itself, and that's when I think you tend to get kind of emperor has no clothes types of dynamics, and loyalty above all else is sort of privileged. And so you need to say, the people around the leader need to say what he or she expects them to say or wants to hear.
Well, unfortunately, we're at the end of our hour, and thank you, Rachel, so much for this conversation. It's such a complicated, rich, but also really important topic. So thanks so much for sharing your research and your insights on this. And thanks to all of you in the audience for being with us. We'll have future programming, quite a lot of it actually, around these topics on the state of democracy. Just one advertisement. Some of you were tuned in to our 2 democracy summits, Denver democracy summits we've run over the last 2 years. Later this year in the fall, we'll be having our 3rd democracy summit, I think this time at least partially in person. So hope that some of you can join us in person. So a lot more to say about democracy. But again, thank you, Rachel, for a great conversation today. And thank all of you for being with us.
Thank you. And thanks for the wonderful questions from the audience as well.